The dim light flickered as the train rumbled into the underground subway station, the cold air circulating through the tunnel. It was an ordinary evening, like any other. But for one unsuspecting woman, her world was about to change forever. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the empty platform as she slowly made her way towards the train, gripping her purse tightly with one hand and her cane with the other. She was old, frail, perhaps too trusting of the busy world around her. Little did she know, today she would become the target of something much darker than she could have imagined. As she reached the turnstile, a figure approached from behind. His footsteps were light, almost deliberate, but they carried an edge of urgency. Dressed in a tattered jacket and a hood pulled low over his face, the man looked like he belonged in the shadows. To anyone passing by, he was just another commuter, blending in perfectly with the crowd, but his intentions were far from innocent. The woman paused for a brief moment, her eyes scanning the platform, oblivious to the danger inching closer. She was lost in thought, perhaps thinking about her family or the peaceful evening she had ahead. But her peace was about to be shattered in the most unexpected way. Without warning, the man lunged at her. His hand shot out, snatching the purse from her grip with such force that she stumbled back. The woman's eyes widened in shock as she gasped for breath. Her frail body trembled with the sudden jolt of adrenaline, but she couldn't do anything to stop him. She let out a cry, but it was too late. The thief was already halfway up the stairs, running toward the exit with her purse in hand, completely unaware of the set of eyes watching from the shadows. Hidden just a few feet away, someone stood, watching the entire scene unfold. A man with a calm yet determined expression on his face, his eyes fixed on the thief. His posture was relaxed, almost as if nothing could faze him. But there was something about the way he stood, something unspoken, that sent a chill down anyone who might have been observing him. This man wasn't just any ordinary commuter. He wasn't just another passerby. This man was Keanu Reeves. Yes, you heard that right. Keanu Reeves, the Hollywood star known for his iconic roles in movies like The Matrix and John Wick, had found himself in an unlikely situation. He wasn't filming a scene or preparing for a big production. He was simply on his way home, taking the subway like any other person. But what was happening before him was far from ordinary. It wasn't just the theft that caught his attention. It was the way the thief was moving, the cold, calculated desperation in his actions. Keanu's instincts, honed from years of playing characters who fought for justice, immediately kicked in. But what could one man do against a thief on the run, especially in a crowded, unfamiliar subway station? Keanu didn't have a gun or a sword, just his wits and the sharp awareness of his surroundings. And that's when it happened. The thief made a fatal mistake. In his rush to escape, he stumbled. The purse flew from his hands, landing on the tracks just as the sound of the approaching train filled the station. Panic surged through the thief as the train's headlights grew closer. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. He hesitated. The subway train rolled forward, its arrival imminent, and in the thief's mind, all he could think about was the woman he'd just robbed and the nightmare that was coming for him. But then something shifted in the air. Keanu moved. With the precision and swiftness of a man who had spent years training for just such a moment, Keanu dashed toward the tracks. The train was now just seconds away, and the thief, too paralyzed by fear, seemed unable to make a move. Keanu reached the edge of the platform in a single fluid motion, his hand grabbing the thief by the shoulder. He yanked the man back just in time, pulling him away from the tracks and into the safety of the platform. But the danger wasn't over. The thief wasn't done yet. He struggled, desperate to break free from Keanu's grip, his face contorted in panic. The sound of the screeching train echoed behind them, its arrival at the station sending a shudder through the air. Keanu's eyes locked with the thief's, a silent understanding passing between them. The thief was trapped, cornered in a way that he hadn't anticipated, and yet his fight wasn't over. What would happen next? Would the thief make another attempt to escape, or would Keanu be able to stop him before he could hurt anyone else? The tension in the air was thick, the stakes higher than ever. As the scene unfolded, it became clear that not everything was as it seemed, and Keanu's involvement in this strange twist of fate was far from ordinary. Stay tuned to find out what happens when Keanu Reeves faces off with a desperate thief in the depths of a subway station, because what comes next might just surprise you. The thief, still grasping at his racing heartbeat, was now fully aware of his situation. His eyes darted between Keanu and the incoming train, both his options narrowing by the second. Fear was written all over his face. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was something far more complicated, far more dangerous. The subway station, normally an indifferent place where people came and went without a second glance, had suddenly transformed into a battleground. And Keanu Reeves, the quiet, unassuming man standing in front of him, was now his unexpected adversary. Keanu didn't say a word. His expression remained calm, detached even, but there was something in his eyes. A quiet intensity, an unspoken promise. The thief, sweating and panicked, realized that no matter how hard he struggled, he was caught. His body tensed, ready to fight or flee, but the moment he met Keanu's gaze, something in him hesitated. It was as if Keanu's very presence commanded respect, a force of will that was impossible to ignore. It made the thief second-guess his next move. But then a thief broke the silence. "Let me go, man." His voice was desperate, crackling with fear. "I didn't mean any harm. I just needed the money." Keanu's grip didn't loosen. He was aware of the situation, but his eyes never strayed far from the thief. "I know," he said quietly, almost as if he understood. "But you can't do this. Not to her." The thief froze, his eyes widening for a moment. Keanu's words hung in the air, almost as if they were more than just an accusation. They were a challenge. A challenge to stop the madness, to reconsider what had brought the thief to this point. But how did Keanu know what was going on in his life? How did he know that this wasn't just a random act of violence? The truth was, Keanu wasn't just another commuter. He wasn't just a random bystander who happened to witness a crime. Keanu had seen this before, not in the movies, but in real life. The poverty, the desperation, the choices that people made when they had no other options. Keanu knew how the system worked, how it could chew people up and spit them out, how life could lead someone to the edge, to the point where they felt they had nothing left to lose. But that didn't mean he was going to let this happen. Not today, not on his watch. The thief's breath quickened, and for a second, it looked like he might try to lash out. But then his eyes flicked back to the train, just a few feet away now, and the harsh reality of the moment hit him. He was cornered, and Keanu's grip on his shoulder was unyielding. The faint sound of the train's screeching brakes filled the station, and for a split second, time seemed to stretch. Keanu shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his stance. He wasn't moving aggressively, but there was a certain stillness to him, a focus that felt almost unnerving. The thief, now fully aware that there was no escape, relaxed his posture slightly. His shoulders slumped, a defeated look crossing his face. It was as if the realization had dawned on him. There was no getting away with this. Still, something about the whole situation didn't sit right with Keanu. The thief's panic, his desperation, didn't match the usual script of a common subway robbery. There was something deeper at play here. Why had the thief specifically targeted the elderly woman? Why had he made such a hasty escape attempt, risking everything for a simple purse? As if reading Keanu's thoughts, the thief let out a shaky laugh, his voice tinged with bitterness. "You think this is just about the money?" he asked, his eyes suddenly sharp, defiant. "You think I'm just some criminal doing what criminals do? I'm not like that. Not anymore." Keanu raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "Then what's this really about?" he asked, his voice steady, probing. The thief hesitated for a moment, then looked away, his eyes shifting nervously. He glanced back at the woman who was still standing a few feet away, her shaking hands clutching her cane. Her eyes were wide with shock, but there was no fear in them, just confusion. It was as if she couldn't quite understand what had just happened. The thief's gaze softened as he saw her, but it didn't last long. "Look, I didn't plan for any of this," the thief muttered, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "But sometimes you don't get to choose. You don't get to pick the path your life takes. You just end up where you end up. And when you're desperate, when you have nothing, any chance, any opportunity feels like your only shot." He paused, his throat tight. "I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just needed her purse. I just needed to get out of here. I wasn't going to." Keanu's eyes narrowed. "What weren't you going to do?" he asked, his tone now laced with suspicion. The thief swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously from Keanu to the woman, then back to Keanu. "I didn't want to hurt her," he repeated, his voice trembling. "But you wouldn't understand. You don't know what it's like. How do you make people listen when they've already written you off? How do you make them understand that you're just trying to survive?" The words hung heavily in the air, and for a moment, Keanu felt a pang of sympathy. He had seen the darkest corners of humanity. He had lived them in the roles he played, and in the years of training that came with those roles. But this wasn't the usual fight scene. This wasn't a script. This was real, and the reality was much more complicated. The thief's body language began to shift again. His shoulders slumped, and his eyes lost the fire they had just moments ago. He seemed smaller now, more defeated, as though the weight of his own choices was sinking in. But before Keanu could say anything more, a loud shout echoed across the platform. A voice, sharp and full of authority, called out from the shadows. "Hey, what's going on here?" Both Keanu and the thief turned toward the sound. The voice belonged to a subway officer who had apparently noticed the commotion. His uniform gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights as he strode toward them, his hand instinctively resting on the baton at his side. The officer's eyes darted between the two men, taking in the situation at a glance. Keanu knew this was his moment. He had to act quickly, but something told him that the situation wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. The officer was looking at the thief now, but Keanu could tell the man wasn't entirely sure what had happened. The air was still thick with tension, the kind that only grows when a crowd begins to form, when questions start to be asked. And Keanu wasn't the only one who had a lot to lose here. Would the thief's story hold up? What was the real reason behind the robbery? And what would happen when the authorities got involved? Keanu knew one thing for certain: the answers weren't as simple as they appeared, not by a long shot. The subway officer took a few more steps, his boots clicking against the platform's cold concrete. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, and his uniform made him seem almost too imposing for a station like this. His eyes scanned the scene, the elderly woman still standing by the turnstile, her face pale, the thief struggling beneath Keanu's grip, and Keanu himself, calm, composed, but undeniably the centerpiece of the chaos. The officer raised an eyebrow, his gaze moving between the two men. "What's going on here?" he repeated, his voice low, but not without authority. Keanu didn't move. He wasn't about to speak until he understood more. He knew that the officer would expect a standard answer. The thief had robbed the woman, and that was that. But Keanu felt the situation was more complicated than that. He could sense it in the thief's words, in his eyes, even in his body language. There was a story here, one that wasn't as simple as a crime of opportunity. The thief, on the other hand, knew that time was running out. His face was pale, his hands still shaking from adrenaline. He knew that any moment now, the officer would take charge, and whatever had happened between him and Keanu would be overshadowed by the law. It was all about to spiral out of his control. His mind raced, desperately trying to think of something, anything that could get him out of this mess. The thief stammered, but he couldn't get the words out. His throat was dry, his heart hammering in his chest. Keanu watched him, sensing the desperation, but he wasn't going to make it easy for the man. He held him firmly in place, his grip still steady. "You'll have to explain yourself to him now," Keanu said quietly, his voice low but pointed. "But maybe there's more to this than you're telling." The thief glanced at Keanu, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and confusion. Was Keanu actually helping him? Was he on his side? For a moment, the thief wasn't sure if he had imagined it, but there it was. Keanu's calm resolve seemed to offer him a flicker of hope. But then, the officer's voice cut through the tension. "Enough with the games. I'll deal with this," he said, reaching out to pull the thief away from Keanu. But before he could get a firm hold, the woman spoke up. "Wait," she said softly, her voice trembling but still resolute. She had been quiet until now, but her presence was like a silent force in the room. Her face, once filled with confusion, now bore the marks of something deeper: sadness, regret, perhaps a glimmer of understanding. The officer paused, his hand still hovering near the thief's arm. He turned toward her. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his tone softening slightly. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady despite the strain. She looked at the officer and then at Keanu, her eyes lingering on him for a moment, as if she could sense something in him that didn't belong in a subway station. "But the man, he doesn't mean any harm." The officer frowned, clearly confused. "What do you mean, he doesn't mean any harm? He just tried to rob you." The woman shook her head slowly. "I'm not saying what he did was right," she replied, "but I think he's just in trouble." Her voice wavered slightly, but she stood her ground. "I saw it in his eyes. He wasn't going to hurt me." Keanu couldn't help but admire her strength. Her words, though simple, held weight. She was not just a victim, she was seeing something the officer wasn't. But it wasn't just that. There was something more to her. The officer looked at the woman, then back at the thief. He was starting to doubt what he had originally assumed. "What's your story then?" he asked, his voice turning more skeptical. The thief looked down, unable to meet the officer's gaze. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He didn't know how to explain it, how to explain a lifetime of bad decisions and the crushing weight of choices he couldn't undo. The truth felt too complicated, too messy, and he wasn't sure anyone would believe him. Keanu stepped closer, his presence making the officer shift slightly. He wasn't afraid of the officer, but he could sense that this was a delicate moment. The woman's words, the thief's silence, the officer's growing uncertainty, all of it added layers to a story that had yet to unfold. "This isn't just about a stolen purse," Keanu said quietly, his eyes now focused on the officer. "It never was." The officer narrowed his eyes at Keanu, still trying to piece together the situation. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice low. "You're telling me this guy didn't just try to rob her?" Keanu shook his head, his expression unreadable. "There's more to it. Trust me, I can see it." The officer paused, considering Keanu's words. He was trained to deal with simple crimes, not moral dilemmas. But the way Keanu spoke, calm, collected, made him wonder if there was more at play here. The thief wasn't your typical criminal, and Keanu's words weren't just empty chatter. The officer looked back at the thief, his eyes narrowing once again. "You've got a lot of explaining to do," the officer said, his tone harsh but uncertain. But the thief, still frozen, suddenly flinched. His hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightening. He'd opened his mouth as though he was about to speak, but then he froze again, as if some dark realization was dawning on him. Keanu noticed the shift immediately. There was something happening in the thief's mind, something shifting in his posture. His shoulders slumped, and he looked like he was about to collapse. Keanu took a step forward, his hand hovering just a few inches away from the thief's arm. "What is it?" Keanu asked quietly, his voice almost gentle now. "What's going on?" The thief swallowed, his eyes filled with a kind of fear that seemed to be coming from a place deeper than the situation at hand. "I didn't want to do it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to hurt anyone, but they've been watching me, watching us, watching all of us." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything stopped. Keanu's heart skipped a beat, and even the officer's posture changed. The tension in the air thickened, becoming almost unbearable. "Who?" Keanu asked, his voice low. but urgent. "Who's been watching you?" The thief looked up, his eyes wild. "I can't say. Not yet. They know everything. They know who I am, what I've done, and what I'm about to do." Keanu's mind raced. This was no longer just about a robbery. Something much darker was unfolding, something that had been lurking beneath the surface all along, and it was only just beginning to reveal itself. The officer's brow furrowed, but he didn't speak. The elderly woman, too, seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, her eyes darting between the two men, her breathing quickening. The shadows in the station suddenly felt a lot darker, and the questions that hung in the air were only just beginning to unfold. The words the thief had just spoken hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating the space around them. Keanu could feel the weight of them pressing down on him, each syllable more unnerving than the last. "They've been watching me, watching all of us." The implications were impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the robbery. It wasn't just about money or desperation. There was something far more sinister going on, something hidden beneath the surface, a shadow lurking just out of sight. Keanu's mind raced, trying to process what he had just heard. The officer was still standing there, clearly puzzled but beginning to feel the gravity of the situation. The woman, too, was visibly shaken now, her eyes wide and darting between Keanu and the thief. She had been calm, almost too calm, earlier. Now, though, she was looking around nervously, as if expecting something or someone to appear from the shadows. "Who?" Keanu asked again, his voice tighter now. His instincts were telling him there was more to this than just a desperate thief trying to make a quick getaway. The thief's sudden shift in behavior, the words about being watched, it was all pointing to something much darker, something he had never expected to encounter in a subway station. The thief opened his mouth again, his voice trembling. "I can't say. I don't know who they are, but I know they're watching me, watching us, watching everyone." He glanced nervously over his shoulder, his eyes darting to the darkened corners of the platform, as if he half expected someone to emerge from the shadows. "They've got their eyes on all of us. They know what we've done, what we're about to do. They'll never let us go." Keanu's grip on the thief's shoulder tightened. "Who are you talking about? Who's watching you?" The thief shook his head violently, as if the very question was too much to handle. "I don't know. I can't explain it. It's like they've been here the whole time. Like they've been tracking every step I've taken for weeks, maybe longer." His breath came faster now, a mix of fear and frustration. "I didn't want to steal from her. I didn't want to hurt anyone. But they made me. I had no choice. They're watching everything." The officer was clearly losing patience. "All right, enough of this. You've been caught red-handed. No more excuses. You're coming with me." He reached out to grab the thief's arm, but before he could, the thief jerked back violently, his eyes wide with terror. "No, you don't understand," the thief shouted, panic rising in his voice. "They'll know. They'll find me. You don't know who they are. You don't know what they can do." Keanu exchanged a glance with the officer, who hesitated, his hand still extended. The entire station seemed to hold its breath. The woman had stepped back a few paces, her eyes darting around the platform, as if she, too, was expecting something to happen, something terrible. Then, as if on cue, the lights above them flickered. The sudden movement of the light caused a wave of tension to ripple through the air, and in that brief moment of disorientation, the atmosphere shifted. The overhead lights flickered again, more erratically this time, casting long, eerie shadows across the platform. The train, which had been expected moments ago, was nowhere in sight. The station, normally busy with commuters, felt empty, silent, and dangerously still. Keanu's eyes moved to the entrance of the station, his body alert, every muscle tensed. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something far worse than they were prepared for. He could sense it in the air, like a storm brewing just out of sight. His mind flashed back to the thief's words, to the fear in his eyes, to the way he had looked over his shoulder like he was expecting something, or someone, to appear. The officer, too, seemed to sense it. He reached for his radio, But before he could speak into it, another flicker of movement caught Keanu's attention. This time, it wasn't just a shadow. A figure emerged from the darkness at the far end of the platform. It was a man, tall, with a dark jacket that blended seamlessly into the surroundings. His face was obscured by a hood, but the way he moved was deliberate, calculating. Keanu's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea who this man was, but the sudden appearance of someone who seemed to know exactly what was going on only deepened the tension. The officer noticed him too, his hand tightening around his baton. The figure didn't look like an ordinary commuter or even a security guard. There was something about him, something menacing. The thief let out a sharp gasp, his body visibly shaking. "No," he cried, his voice breaking. "It's them. They found me." His eyes were wide with terror as he stumbled backward, almost knocking over the elderly woman. Keanu's instincts took over. He didn't need any more explanations. Without thinking, he moved forward, stepping between the thief and the oncoming figure. The officer, still confused, but now understanding the gravity of the situation, backed up slowly, his hand still on his baton, ready for whatever was about to happen. "Stay back," Keanu warned, his voice low, filled with warning. He wasn't sure what he was dealing with, but his gut told him it was something dangerous. The man in the shadows was no ordinary passerby. The figure didn't respond. He just kept walking, the echo of his footsteps growing louder, resonating in the otherwise silent station. Keanu's hand hovered near his jacket, where he kept a small knife for protection. He wasn't sure if it would help, but he was prepared. The figure didn't look like he was armed, at least not visibly, but there was a chilling aura about him. It was as though the figure wasn't just walking toward them, he was walking through them, his very presence bending the air around him. The woman, still standing near the turnstile, began to speak, her voice trembling but firm. "You don't have to do this," she said, her words barely above a whisper. "Whatever this is, it doesn't have to end in violence." The figure paused just a few feet away from Keanu. For a moment, there was silence, heavy, suffocating silence. And then, without warning, the man spoke, his voice low, gravelly, as if it came from somewhere deep and far away. "You have no idea what you're up against," he said, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "None of you do." Keanu's muscles tensed. The words weren't just a threat, they were a warning. The officer shifted uneasily, but Keanu knew something had shifted irrevocably in that moment. The air around them was electric, charged with a sense of impending danger. Everything had changed, and nothing would ever be the same. What was this man's connection to the thief? Who was he? And why had the thief said they were watching him? The answers were just out of reach, and the tension was unbearable. And then, just as Keanu prepared to confront the figure head-on, the station lights flickered again. This time, they didn't come back on. And in that darkness, something moved. In the sudden darkness, everything became a blur. The only sounds in the station were the erratic beats of their hearts, the soft rustle of clothing, and the occasional shuffle of footsteps. The air felt colder now, as though the very atmosphere had thickened, becoming oppressive. Keanu's senses were on high alert. His eyes adjusted to the blackness, but it felt like someone, was just out of his reach. His ears strained, trying to pick up the slightest sound, but it was as if the world had gone still, as if the very darkness had swallowed every noise. And then it came, a sudden sharp sound, like a faint click, followed by a rustling, as if something heavy was being moved. Keanu's heart skipped a beat, his muscles tensing in anticipation. The sound wasn't coming from the figure standing a few feet away. It was coming from behind them, near the far side of the platform. The officer's voice broke the silence, rough with confusion. "What the hell is going on?" His hand gripped his baton even tighter, his posture growing more defensive. But his voice trembled, betraying the fear he was trying so hard to suppress. Keanu didn't answer. His eyes flicked toward the thief, who was visibly trembling, looking over his shoulder with a desperate, almost manic expression. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His hands were shaking violently, his body language screaming for escape, but there was no escape in the darkness. Whatever was coming wasn't just after him, it was after all of them. Keanu stepped forward, slowly, his eyes never leaving the figure who still hadn't moved. The man in the dark hoodie was eerily still, like a statue in the center of the station. His eyes seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, the only indication that he was still there. And yet, as Keanu moved toward him, he couldn't shake the feeling that the man wasn't the real threat. That's when he heard it again, a rustling noise, but this time much closer. Keanu turned sharply, his pulse spiking, and the thief's terrified scream echoed through the station. No, 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 no. The thief's voice cracked as he backed away, his face now pale, sweat dripping from his forehead. They found me. It's too late. We're all dead. Before Keanu could react, the lights flickered again, and in that brief flash of illumination, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure, a shadow, darted out from behind the pillar at the far end of the platform. It moved so fast, so silently, that it seemed to glide rather than walk. And then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanished into the blackness again, leaving only the sound of the thief's frantic breathing behind. Keanu didn't hesitate. He took a step toward the source of the movement, his body instinctively tensing. But just as his foot touched the ground, a shrill scream rang out from the opposite end of the platform. The woman, the elderly woman, her voice high-pitched and filled with a kind of raw terror Keanu had never heard before. He spun toward her, only to find her crumpled against the wall, clutching her chest as if trying to stop the beating of her own heart. Her eyes were wide, glazed over with fear, as if she had seen something beyond human comprehension. They're here, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the thumping of his pulse. It's too late. We're all doomed. The officer rushed to her side, but Keanu was already moving. He didn't know what was happening, but everything told him that whatever was going on here, it wasn't normal. It was something beyond his control, something he couldn't fight with his fists or even his wits. The atmosphere was thick with dread now, and the station felt more like a trap than a transit hub. And then, as if the entire station had been holding its breath, the darkness split with a sudden deafening sound, a deep, guttural growl. Unlike anything human, it came from the farthest corner of the platform, where the shadowy figure had disappeared moments before. It was unmistakable. Something wasn't just watching them, it was hunting them. Keanu's body went on autopilot. He didn't think, didn't question. It was fight or flight. And there was nowhere to run. Get back. He shouted to the officer and the woman, his voice hoarse. He didn't care that the officer was a trained man of the law. He didn't care that the elderly woman was frightened beyond reason. He could feel it, the cold, ominous presence that was moving closer. The growl deepened, vibrating through his chest. Suddenly, the lights above flickered once more and then silence. The entire platform plunged back into darkness, even darker than before, if that was possible. It wasn't just the lights. It was as if the air itself had thickened, becoming dense, heavy, alive with a presence Keanu couldn't understand. He could feel something pulling at him, a force stronger than fear, as if it were trying to drag him down into the depths of the darkness. Then came the sound again, a sickening, hollow thud, followed by a soft scraping noise, like nails dragging across metal. Keanu's skin crawled. The station was no longer just a backdrop to a crime scene. It had turned into something far worse, something far more dangerous. And just as quickly as it had gone dark, the lights flickered back on, only this time, they weren't just flickering. They were flashing, strobing violently, casting erratic shadows across the walls. For a split second, Keanu saw something that made his blood freeze. The man, the figure in the dark hoodie, was no longer standing in front of him. He had vanished, leaving only an empty space where he had once been. But what stood there now was far worse. A creature, humanoid in shape but twisted and deformed in ways Keanu couldn't comprehend. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its face, if it could even be called a face, was an endless void of shadows, a void that seemed to stare at Keanu with a kind of ancient, predatory malice. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed faintly in the dark, an eerie red that pulsed like the beating of a distant heart, and its mouth, stretched wide in a grotesque grin, was filled with jagged, razor-sharp teeth. Keanu didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, his mind spinning, his body moving on instinct. But the creature was faster than anything he had ever seen. It moved like a shadow, like smoke, slipping between the flickering lights, vanishing before he could even get close. The officer, still holding his baton, was frozen in place, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. The woman, now barely conscious, whispered in a trembling voice, "It's too late. It's too late for all of us." Keanu turned to her, but before he could speak, the air shifted again, a sudden shift in the temperature, colder, like the breath of something ancient, something unknowable. And that's when it hit him. The thing that had been watching them wasn't just some human figure, some threat that could be dealt with. It was something far older, far more powerful, something that had been waiting for the right moment to strike. And now that moment had come. Keanu realized that this wasn't just about surviving a subway robbery. This was a fight for something far greater and far more dangerous. The station was no longer just a place to catch a train. It had become a battleground, and the war was only just beginning. The creature's twisted form shifted again in the flickering lights, moving faster than Keanu could track. His heart pounded in his chest, his breaths coming in shallow gasps as he realized the truth of what he was facing. This wasn't just a man in a hoodie, a criminal trying to escape. This was something otherworldly, something that had transcended human comprehension. And it wasn't alone. As the creature lunged toward him, Keanu instinctively stepped back, but the air around him seemed to thicken, constricting, almost like a physical force was pushing him in. The creature's sharp, glinting eyes locked onto his, and Keanu could feel the weight of its stare pressing down on him. His body tensed, his every instinct screaming for him to run, but there was no place to go. The creature was everywhere, and nowhere at the same time. It wasn't bound by space. It was in essence a nightmare made flesh. The officer, still clutching his baton, took a step forward. His voice trembled, but filled with a mix of determination and terror. "We need to fight back," he shouted, though his words lacked conviction. He swung his baton, but it passed straight through the creature, like striking at smoke. The officer froze, horror written across his face, as the realization hit him that nothing they could do would stop this. Keanu took a deep breath, forcing his mind to clear. The first rule in situations like these, however impossible it seemed, was to never let panic take control. If he was going to survive this, they all would have to fight differently. They weren't just dealing with a man who had lost control. They were dealing with something far darker, something that could manipulate reality itself. The thief, still pressed against the far wall, finally found his voice, weak but desperate. "You don't understand. It's not just one of them. They're everywhere. They've been watching me, all of us, all along." His voice cracked, and for the first time, Keanu saw the depth of his fear, as if everything he'd done had been leading to this moment, as if he had known this encounter was inevitable. Keanu's mind raced. The thief hadn't just been a random criminal. He hadn't been acting out of mere desperation. There was something far deeper to his actions. He was just a pawn in a much larger game. "What are you talking about?" Keanu asked, his voice low and intense. "Who are they? Why are they after you?" The thief trembled but managed to stutter. They're not human. They've been watching us. They're the reason people go missing. Why things happen and no one remembers. They know everything, our fears, our regrets. They feed on them." He looked up at Keanu, eyes wide with terror, his voice almost a whisper. "And once they've marked you, they won't stop. They've already taken us all. But you've got to stop them. You have to stop it before it gets worse." Keanu didn't know if he believed him or if the thief was simply unraveling under the pressure of his own fear. But the creature, now only inches away, seemed to react as if it understood their words. It let out a low growl, the sound sending shivers through the air, and in that moment, Keanu realized something horrifying. The creature wasn't alone. The shadows around them began to shift again. More figures, indistinct, indistinguishable from the darkness, began to form at the edges of the platform. Dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, emerged from the dark corners of the station, walking slowly, purposefully toward them. The growls from the creature intensified, a chorus of low, menacing sounds filling the air. Keanu turned toward the officer, and their eyes met in silent understanding. They were completely surrounded, trapped in a nightmare with no way out. And yet, a strange calmness began to settle over Keanu. It wasn't fear that gripped him now. It was clarity. Without another word, he lunged toward the creature, but before his fist could connect, a blinding flash of light erupted from behind him. Keanu stumbled backward, disoriented, shielding his eyes from the sudden brightness. When the light faded, he saw something that made his heart stop. The woman, the elderly woman, was standing in the center of the platform, her frail body illuminated by the strange light. She was no longer trembling. She was calm, serene even, her face radiating an otherworldly peace. The creatures, the shadows, they were no longer moving toward them. Instead, they were recoiling, as if in fear, retreating into the very darkness from which they came. The officer stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. What? What is happening? Keanu didn't answer. He was too focused on the woman, who was no longer the frightened, vulnerable figure she had been. In that moment, she seemed to possess an incredible strength, an energy that seemed to push back the shadows. The creatures were still there, but they were no longer the unstoppable force they had once seemed. They shrank, fading into the corners of the station, as if the woman's presence was burning them away. The thief, wide-eyed, whispered in disbelief, "It's her. It's always been her." Keanu turned toward him, confusion taking root. "What do you mean? Who is she?" The thief, trembling, looked at the elderly woman, his face a mix of reverence and fear. "She's the reason they came. She's been chosen. She's the key. She's the one who can stop them." Keanu's mind reeled. Stop them. He could barely comprehend what was happening. The woman wasn't just a bystander. She was part of this nightmare. She had power that could control the very creatures that had haunted them. The elderly woman, still bathed in that strange light, began to speak, her voice low and steady. "It's too late for all of us," she said, her words filled with a deep sadness. "But you, Keanu, you are the one they did not foresee." She turned her gaze to the thief, her eyes narrowing. "You too, you were never meant to be a pawn. But you're here now, and together you must decide." Keanu's heart raced as he tried to piece it all together. The woman, this powerless-looking elderly figure, was the key. But to what? To stopping the creatures. To freeing them all from this endless nightmare. And then, just as Keanu was about to ask, the final twist shattered everything he thought he understood. The woman's expression darkened, and with a small, almost imperceptible movement, she snapped her fingers. Suddenly, everything went black. Keanu's senses vanished. No sound, no light, only darkness, complete, infinite darkness. And then, out of the void, came a whisper that carried across time itself, echoing in his mind. "You were never meant to escape." The voice was chilling, omnipotent. Keanu tried to move to fight, but his body wouldn't respond. The shadows were closing in again, but this time, they weren't after him. They were after someone else. The woman. She had been the one controlling them all along. And now, the real nightmare was just beginning. Keanu's mind swirled with confusion as he drifted in the endless darkness. He tried to move, to break free from the stillness, but his body was frozen, as if tethered to the void itself. The whisper, cold and omnipotent, still echoed in his ears, sending shivers down his spine. The words hung in the air like a chilling omen. "You were never meant to escape." His thoughts were racing, but every attempt to grasp a semblance of reality slipped through his fingers like smoke. There were no sounds, no colors, only the sensation of falling, endless and weightless. Suddenly, the darkness around him shifted, breaking apart in the form of fragmented images, flashing memories, scenes from earlier, before everything had descended into chaos, came rushing back. The elderly woman standing in the station, her presence calm and serene. The creature, its twisted form lurking in the shadows. The thief, trembling with terror, speaking of forces far beyond their control. It all played out like a twisted reel of film, but now, Keanu understood it in a way he hadn't before. The woman was the key, not just to the creature's presence, but to everything. She wasn't just some innocent bystander, she was the catalyst. The darkness that surrounded them, the creatures that had emerged from the shadows, were all bound to her in ways Keanu hadn't even begun to understand. The power she held, the terrifying control she exerted, was part of a much older, darker force than anyone could comprehend. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the darkness began to dissipate. Keanu's vision cleared, and he found himself standing once again on the subway platform, the dim lights flickering above him. The station was eerily quiet, empty, except for the figures that remained. The officer, the thief, and the elderly woman. The woman was no longer bathed in the strange light. Her expression was no longer calm, but wary, her eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful resignation. The creatures were gone, vanished, as if they had never existed, but the air still felt heavy, laden with the tension of what had transpired. Keanu looked at the officer, who was standing frozen, his face pale, still trying to make sense of the events that had unfolded. He had no answers, no explanation, just the stark realization that whatever had happened here was far beyond anything they had ever dealt with. The thief, on the other hand, had collapsed to the floor, his body trembling, as if the weight of everything he had just witnessed had shattered him. He was still muttering to himself, but his words were unintelligible, fragments of fear and disbelief. Keanu approached the woman, his steps slow, careful. "What happened?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "What are you?" She looked up at him, her eyes wary but resolute. "I told you, it's too late for all of us," she said softly. "But it's not too late for you." Keanu shook his head. "What do you mean? You've been controlling them all along, those creatures, the shadows. How?" The woman sighed, her voice distant. "It's not control, not in the way you think. I've been waiting for them to come back, to finish what they started." Her eyes darkened,